Now, a little bit later on, the radical Republicans came up with a plan, and their plan was that 50% of eligible voters had to sign a loyalty oath from any particular state before that state was allowed to begin the process that would bring it back into the Union. And this usually meant writing a new constitution, a new state constitution that forbids slavery. So we can actually tell percentage-wise, Lincoln would be happy with 10%. The radical Republicans said, no, we want 50% of the voters to sign the loyalty oath before we'll even think about allowing these states back into the Union. Now, this legislation was passed by Congress, but Lincoln killed it by issuing a pocket veto. And a pocket veto is this: he didn't veto it. He just put it in a drawer, and then the congressional session ran out, and so it didn't become law. That's what a pocket veto is. So Lincoln kind of killed it, but he kind of killed this 50% plan in a kind of a quiet way. So what you the big picture here is that as the war is winding up, but even in the middle of the war, when there's beginning to be discussions about the post-war period, there are major differences between Abraham Lincoln and other moderate Republicans and the so-called radical Republicans in the North. And it's very unclear how Lincoln would have papered over these differences, or if he could have had he lived. Now, we do know that Lincoln pushed for the passage of the 13th Amendment. I talked about that in a previous podcast. He felt it had to be done immediately because he knew that when the Civil War ended, the Emancipation Proclamation lost all its force because it was a military measure. So, to his credit, Lincoln does push for a quick constitutional amendment that's ultimately passed in December of 1865. And in retrospect, it was very smart of Lincoln to really press ahead on the 13th Amendment because he was assassinated just a couple of months after Congress passed the amendment. As you probably know, or as you should know, the amendment has to pass in Congress, and then it has to pass 2/3 of the state. So it had passed in Congress through bribery and other kind of underhanded ways that, thank God, Lincoln resorted to. But in the necessary 2/3 of the states voted on it by December of 1865. So Lincoln does push hard for the 13th Amendment. And the other thing is that by the time Lincoln is assassinated, he is also thinking about whether or not there should be limited black suffrage, African American suffrage. And suffrage, for those of you who don't know, it's just another way of talking about voting and voting rights. And Lincoln, he hinted very broadly that, or he actually proposed that some African Americans, a group that included free African Americans, and some African Americans who had enlisted in the army, deserved the right to vote. So by the time he was killed, Lincoln is moving towards granting suffrage, granting the vote to a limited number of African Americans. He probably would have had them take literacy tests. It's very interesting and significant, and I think that he thought military service was an important criteria for the vote. So this is the way that Lincoln was drifting by the time he was assassinated. Not a broad overall suffrage for all African American males, and of course at this point it's all about men, right? Because women's suffrage doesn't happen until 1919 in the United States. So that's the direction that Lincoln was moving. And 3 days after he floated this proposal, he was assassinated. So that's where he stood by the time of his death. Now, there's one other quick aspect of post-emancipation life for slaves that I'm going to talk briefly about, but I'll talk about in great detail a little bit further on. And that's a bureau called the Freedmen's Bureau. In the Freedmen's Bureau, and again, the name is obvious, it's freedmen, but it covered women too, and children, but it was called the Freedmen's Bureau. It was created in March 1865 with Lincoln's approval. And the idea of this was actually the first bureaucracy in the history of the United States that was created to assist a group of Americans with find jobs, gain education, gain some medical care, gain some food as well. So there was a recognition in the North that African Americans, freed African Americans, those who had just been slaves, needed quite a bit of help when they gained their freedom. That the government did have to step in and create kind of institutions, social assistance institutions, to help these folks get their feet off the ground. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau is going to have a controversial life, but right now I just want to introduce the idea that there was at least some recognition among Northerners, both radicals and moderates, that there needed to be some kind of government agency, at least for a short period of time, to offer ex-slaves, to give them a hand, to give them some government support. The other thing that the Freedmen's Bureau did was it created courts made up of Army officers that helped adjudicate disputes between freed slaves and their former owners. There were all kinds of issues that come out of emancipation, where free slaves were making some demands from their former owners. Former owners, white owners, were making demands on freed slaves. And these courts were created to help judge these disputes. And the reason that the government had to step in is that Northerners recognized that no courts in the South, that obviously would be made up of whites, would ever rule in favor of an ex-slave. And there needed to be some kind of neutral party. So you do have at least the glimmer, at least the creation of a short-lived government institution that was designed to give a hand to ex-slaves, which was called the Freedmen's Bureau. So now what? So we get to Lincoln's assassination. The radical Republicans were not unhappy when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and that's putting it mildly. The more extreme, and I hate, again, these words are so prejudicial. I actually kind of admire the radical Republicans. I think their hearts were in the right place. I agree with their policies. Thaddeus Stevens, he was from Pennsylvania. He was one of the most famous radical Republicans. He was actually, when he died, he was buried in an African-American cemetery. He had his body put in he was interred in, or he was, I guess the word's interred in an African-American cemetery. He wanted to show his solidarity with the African-American community. He also apparently had a consensual relationship with a freed African-American woman. You see a little bit of this if you saw the movie Lincoln. Stevens is played by Tommy Lee Jones in Lincoln. And so, I think the radicals were politically, I think they were in the right place, but their reputation has really suffered in U.S. history, and that's because I think, for the most part, until the last 20 or 30 years, maybe 40 years now, as I get older, a lot of white historians were hostile to the goals of equality, political and social equality for African Americans. Okay, but let's go back to Andrew Johnson, or the radicals. The radicals are very happy that Lincoln is killed. They didn't have any hand in it. They've been very, very frustrated with Abraham Lincoln throughout his presidency. They thought he moved slowly on emancipation. They weren't happy on his plans to work with the white South. The 10% plan enraged them. They wanted 50% to have white Southerners to have to sign loyalty oaths, and so they just were just beside themselves with Abraham Lincoln. They also felt like he was not thinking about ex-slaves. He didn't really care about them that much, and they assume that Lincoln's successor, a guy by the name of Andrew Johnson, is going to be much tougher on the white South than was Abraham Lincoln. This is their assumption. Now, the key thing, and this is where I'll end this podcast, not this particular podcast. I'm not done for today. This is the key. At first, the radicals are not upset at all that Lincoln is off the scene. They didn't want him dead, but he's off the scene. And they think that Lincoln's vice president, and I'll talk about him in the next podcast, this guy named Andrew Johnson, is in their pocket. He's one of them. They're convinced of that because he had made noises that he wanted to punish the white South. So they're very, very happy initially with Andrew Johnson. Here's the thing, and here's what I want to leave you with in this particular podcast. I'm going to continue on with the lecture in just a second. Andrew Johnson betrays the radical Republicans, at least from their point of view. Andrew Johnson turns out to be very conciliatory towards the white South, much more so than Abraham Lincoln. And by 1867, the radical Republicans are trying to impeach Andrew Johnson. Is it 18? Yeah, it's 1867. And they're trying to remove him from office. And so the radicals begin the Andrew Johnson presidency thinking that he's a guy that they can work with, but very, very quickly they become the bitterest of enemies.